Hello, my loves. Welcome back this week. As you can tell from the title, we are talking about trust, being able to trust yourself. And boy, is this a topic that I am like simultaneously in love with, has been a huge theme in my life, is something I am passionate about teaching massively in my work, and also so tricky and triggering and activating for me to talk about as well. I've already tried to record this episode like 3 times and had to start over because, yeah, it's just such a big topic in my mind. The idea of self trust, it's very multifaceted. My brain goes off in a million different ADHD directions when I think about it and want to talk about it, which is why I don't think I've ever done an episode specifically on it, although it is definitely a theme threaded throughout all of my work. But I decided to tackle this topic head on because as I was really just sitting this week, preparing to drop in and kind of check in intuitively with what is the episode that's wanting to be born, wanting to come through me this week in the podcast, especially after coming off of our fate versus destiny episode last week, which I loved and felt very, very drawn towards. As I was sitting and digesting that, I paused for a little bit and actually decided to go review some of my interviews that have come in this last week for women wanting to join the Stay or Go community. And I was struck once again as I was watching these interviews at how much over and over I see women that are, wanting to join my community. They do these interviews, and in the interviews, there are all these beautiful questions that I've structured for Alex to ask them, my assistant. And one of the biggest ones is, what are you wanting from the community? Or, what's the support you're most needing? And without fail, over and over, I will hear things like, I just want to know that I'm not making a mistake. I want to be sure that I'm not overreacting. I really want to feel more confident and sure of myself. I want to hear other women's experiences and make sure that like I'm on track, or I'm looking for, emotional support and validation. I've talked to lots of people, even lawyers, and I think I like really actually already know my answer, but for some reason I can't take the next step. I'm still feeling really stuck, and I want to make sure that I'm not wrong about this. And underneath all of those phrases, what those women are really asking is it safe to trust myself? Is it safe to trust what I feel called towards? Even if, and most especially if, what I feel called towards does not make sense intellectually, does not match with everything I've ever been taught or told is the life I'm supposed to be living. Even if what I feel called towards in some ways feels absolutely terrifying, and in certain ways will be harder maybe than perhaps my life is right now, or make things more difficult in some ways. Is it safe to trust what I feel called towards, even if it means walking out into the unknown without certainty that everything will work out, right? These are the questions underneath, the questions that hit at the very like the gut punch part of why the process of considering divorce is so intense. Listening to these women in these interviews, it just really took me back to how when we are in that process, it can feel like being a boat out on the ocean in a giant storm. Like we are being tossed up and down by the waves. when you are in a storm like that, you can't throw down your anchor. There's nothing to anchor to. And if you were to throw down the anchor, it would rip your boat apart. So in moments like this, where do we find the certainty? Where do we find safety? And over, what I have seen is that safety, that certainty is developed in self-trust, in learning how to come back to what is deep down inside of you and ultimately trusting the self, which, just a heads up, is so difficult because for many of us, that's the exact opposite thing we were trained to do in childhood. Now, I want to be clear that, yes, we're talking about this very kind of like big amorphous idea of self-trust. Hopefully in the ways I'm defining it, you guys can kind of feel that I feel like it's a much, much bigger connection to yourself on a very, very deep level. And that although you might hope this would be the case, you might hope that you can just take a magic pill and self-trust will just magically appear, that actually self-trust is something that we cultivate. And breathe with me through the frustration and disappointment at the it's not something you can just go buy off a shelf. It's not something that just arrives one day. Although, yes, there is the disappointment in it not being a quick fix. The gift in self-trust being something you can cultivate is that is within your power. It is within your power to be able to develop this, to strengthen this. So if you find yourself right now being like, self-trust, it's something I really struggle with, it is not my strong suit, that is exactly what I am needing, and I don't seem to have it, Britta, don't stress. I've got you. That's what this episode is hopefully going to point you towards and directly towards, because I'm going to talk about 3 specific things that, thanks to my goodness, 4+ years of coaching women out on the ocean in their own shitstorms of considering divorce, having gone through the process myself and looking back over all of that knowledge, these 3 things I can pretty much say with deep certainty that if you incorporate these 3 things into your life, you will move forward into a space where you can finally trust yourself while you are making this decision and trying to figure out what your choice is going to be of whether to stay or go. So with that said, let's dive into the first one. And I want to incorporate this analogy that I just gave you guys of being out in the middle of the ocean, big storm, tossed, turned by the waves. I'm going to thread that throughout all of this, because I think with each of these 3 sections, they will tie in really nicely visually for how they help and support you in self-trust and riding the ship in the storm. Okay. So the first one that I want you to have is something I would never have guessed or thought of at the beginning of my journey, way back when I was out on my own ocean considering divorce. And it is community. And not only community, but a community where your self-trust is supported, celebrated, and you feel like you belong. So as we're talking about community, I want you to think of this as the crew. Okay? So previous to adding community into the mix, you are just out there on this giant ship all by yourself out in the ocean. When we incorporate this first one of community, now we have a crew on the boat with us. Okay. Now, why I would never have thought of community in the beginning of my process, and probably I wouldn't even have been able to say it with as much certainty as I do now that I've had the community for a couple of years and seen it for women. I think what underlies that is because more and more, as I'm learning about the systems that we live in that are built all around us, I am noticing how much those systems have isolated us on purpose. Systems like patriarchy, systems like capitalism that benefit from telling us, you can do it all on your own. And all you really need is a spouse and some kids and a home. And that's going to be enough of a support system for you and all of them. And when we don't know any better, that loops us then into following that system and believing that somehow when it's not working, the problem is us, right? When more and more I'm seeing we truly are not meant to do life alone in these ways. We are not meant to be on that ship out in the middle of the ocean all by ourselves. But when our culture tells us that this is the way life is, we then become more isolated. And when we are isolated, we are inherently more fragile. We are more easily manipulated. We are easier to gaslight, and we are easier to control by systems that benefit when we are disconnected from our self-trust, right? If you've been listening to the podcast, I'm thinking episodes about the tragedy of heterosexuality. I'm thinking if there's a podcast that if you're like, Britta, what are these systems? Tell me more. Definitely go listen to Diabolical Lies. That podcast is amazing for exposing and talking about all these different systems around us that I know growing up, nobody taught me about, and nobody was like, hey, be aware of this. These are not here to support you. They may be here to profit off of you. But when you don't know that, and when you think you are the only one struggling in this, which is another theme that I see in these calls, right? Women talking about how this is such a lonely, isolating process of considering divorce. When you think you are the only one struggling, you start to believe that something must be wrong with you, that you are the problem, right? And when that happens, it really does feel like you are out in the middle of the ocean by yourself on a boat, that nobody else understands what you're going through. And that, I think back to my own journey, like right before I started into therapy and started, reaching out for help, coming out of the isolation. Man, those were some of the darkest, most deep, I just remember it being like a black tar inside of me, just the deep, deep, deep fear of, I can't trust myself. I don't even know what I'm doing here. And life is so chaotic and out of control and like not what I thought it was going to be, that I don't really know what's up and what's down right now. And specifically, in that interview that I was listening to where the woman said considering divorce is one of the loneliest processes. That's why she was reaching out to try and join the community. As she said it, I thought to myself, oh, it does not have to be this way. And it shook me a little bit because I don't live in that world anymore where it's like very isolated and alone, because I have my work, I have the beautiful community that I've built. And so I'm watching all these women going through the process of considering divorce and seeing like a totally different reality that they're in. So to be exposed to this woman who's like, considering divorce is one of the loneliest processes, I was like, oh my gosh, that's why I need to like also do this episode speaking directly to that, because it reminded me that yes, it can absolutely feel that way. And not only can it feel that way, I truly believe that culturally, we are taught as women that it should be lonely. It's like we're supposed to punish ourselves for even considering getting divorced. Like, let me be clear that I do believe that's part of the system, that we are told and subliminally messaged that if we are considering divorce, we're supposed to figure it out silently. We're not supposed to talk about it openly. We're supposed to keep it a secret. We are supposed to not make other people uncomfortable by mentioning what we're going through or how difficult it is. And on top of that, sometimes even if you do share it with the people around you, or maybe the community that you're currently a part of, that wouldn't even be safe in itself, because maybe the people in your current community can't accept or see you where you find yourself at. That's why at the beginning, if you guys will notice, I said community where you belong, a community that supports you self-trusting yourself and supports you in following your path. So let me be clear, it's not just any community, it's community that you feel like you belong in. And when we don't have that, we end up trapped inside our own heads. And boy, I'm like raising my hand here, y'all. Boy, do I know what a terribly isolating and lonely place trying to make huge life decisions from that space can be. The burden there when you are up in your head with, especially if you have CPTSD and childhood trauma, all of those things, the burden can be so great there. And this is why the very first thing I have on this list is the importance of community. Because when you are part of a community where you belong, it creates a magic that, I'm honestly just learning through watching the community over these past, we're into like over a year now, almost a year and a half. The community creates magic that I'm learning cannot be underestimated in its power to support you in learning to trust yourself. And I am specifically calling it magic because there is something powerful in humans gathering together, which is why I think it's so important to find, specific communities that are like supportive in the ways you need them to be. But there is inherent magic there. And it is powerful when people gather together. And just because it's powerful doesn't mean it's actually going to be supportive. So this is where I want to be very clear, because I have come from communities where there was not inherent belonging. Okay, I'm thinking specifically of my background being raised as a Mormon. In that community, belonging was purchased with self-denial and self-neglect and honestly, like a lot of, I would say, self-hate, like self-denial. The price of belonging in that community was really turning your authority of your life, turning your trust over to an external authority that would dictate to you what a good life looks like and ultimately punish you when you didn't follow the rules. And so it's very important that I speak of that caveat here around community, because I feel like there are many, many communities in the world like this. And for a lot of us, that may be the community you find yourself in right now. And it doesn't even have to be religious communities. Like there are societal communities, there are neighborhood communities, there are political communities, name it, right? Just communities where people gather together, where belonging ultimately costs you yourself. So let me be clear that when I am talking about a community here, I am talking about a community where trusting yourself first and foremost is celebrated, and where there is a foundation in the community of respecting your right to know what is truth for you. Okay? And, this is why way back at the beginning of my journey, I didn't see community as a really important thing for developing my self-trust, because the only interaction I'd had with community up until that point was through Mormonism. And I actually had to leave that community to reclaim my self-trust. Yeah. So for a long time, I think that's one of the things I'm trying to balance in the world in creating my community, is seeing the lack that there is in the world for communities where individual journeys are celebrated and expected, and where you get to feel like you belong exactly as you are in all the messy humanness that you are and that you are going through, and where you're not pressured to conform or to have answers that like don't resonate deeply in your own soul. I have felt the lack of that in my own life and in creating that here in my community. And, I'm speaking specifically of my community because that's where I have exposure to this. But I know I'm not the only one creating communities like this. I know I have seen them. There are women throughout the world right now creating spaces and containers like this. I've watched women in my community expose us to other groups, other leaders, other communities that they're joining, as well as my community, that are doing similar work. So let me be clear. You may be listening to this thinking like, oh my God, Britta, like yours is the only community. No. There are, and I see them growing, communities out there like this. This is like the silver lining in a world right now where it feels like there is so much pressure on the big stage to conform, so much punishment for not obeying in an authoritarian regime, which, may trigger some of those feelings that we have from our own childhood. But the silver linings are that in response to that, you're going to see people doing this work, people stepping outside of those narrow confines and going, nope, this doesn't work for me, just like I did. This is not aligned with my soul. I was able to develop enough self-trust to chart a different path and then to create something different. Now, big key points for y'all here too that I want you to understand when I'm talking about how important community is to building self-trust.